Only with the benefit of hindsight can we hope to know the real impact of lockdowns on the economy and the nation's mental health. Will Australia's strategy for reopening, the pathway we're carving out in this brave new world, do the job of balancing health outcomes with growth and prosperity for all? Am I sounding cynical? Are we actually being given the whole story? How well are we managing the health and economic trade-offs, and what might the next few months look like? Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free full or forecaster report, Which Experts Can You Trust to Get It Right? theelephantintheroom.com.au. With half the country in lockdown and Sydney just completing its third month, much has been made about the vaccination targets of 70% and 80% of eligible adults being our golden ticket to freedom. But what does this mean? Lockdown's a thing of the past? Get your passports ready and book your overseas trip? Not so fast. This vaccination pathway carrot that's been dangled in front of us is scant on detail. So today we've lined up for a dose of reality. We're joined by Brendan Coates, Economic Policy Program Director at the Grattan Institute, where they've been doing a lot of work on Australia's strategy for reopening. Brendan is no stranger to us. We've discussed housing affordability with him back in episode 89, whether young Aussies should be made to choose between super or home ownership in episode 124, and a pre-vaccination view on the new normal back in episode 153. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Brendan. We're very keen to get a greater understanding of the national plan from you.
Thanks, Veronica. Thanks, Chris. It's good to be with you. I should also mention that in a past life, I actually did do pandemic preparedness in Treasury. So I was involved when we actually did some of those exercises about a decade ago where we thought about what was going to happen. And, you know, it's interesting what's happened since and what we thought about and what we didn't think about.
Ooh, I'd love to hear more about that.
I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Like, I've tried to switch off from a lot of the what's next, you know, reading the news, you know, following all the numbers, because it's just felt like everyone's had an opinion on it since the day one, and those opinions just keep getting blown out. But even with this plan, it feels like it's not really even a plan to me. It feels like it's just to hopefully give society confidence. But what's your thoughts on the sort of stages, and how realistic do you think it is of actually happening?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, like, you know, we're in a world where at the start of last year, we didn't have any options. You know, COVID was a thing that had come out of nowhere in a sense. Our options were basically let it run through the society, which we thought would be pretty bad, to try to sort of flatten the curve, which is what a lot of countries did, where they'd sort of go in periodic lockdowns, out of lockdowns to try to deal with things, to sort of preserve hospital system capacity, or to do kind of what Australia, which was one of the few countries that did manage to do, which is to essentially have zero COVID for long stretches of time in the country. Now, it's not costless. It seemed to me to still be the best approach that we had on the table at the time. You know, by the time people are listening to this, certainly I think it's clear that we've moved away from that strategy now in Sydney and Melbourne. But now vaccines give us a way out. They give us ways of dealing with this problem that are far less costless than the pretty limited strategies that we've had on the table to date. But the challenge, of course, is you've got to vaccinate enough of the population so that COVID doesn't spread incredibly rapidly and still overwhelm your health system amongst your unvaccinated population. That is actually going to be the constraint. It's not a world anymore of saying, well, you know, we can't have anyone die of COVID or we can't have anyone die of anything else. Like, these are trade-offs that, you know, are unavoidable. The challenge, though, is that, you know, people if you have a large number of COVID cases, you end up in a world where you exceed your sort of ICU capacity. And that ends up being the constraint, because people are in ICU for 2 or 3 weeks if they end up in hospital with COVID. And you've only got 2,000 ICU beds in the country. And so if you're using them, normally people are only in there for 2 or 3 days because, you know, I go and have heart surgery, I go to ICU for 2 days to make sure that I'm okay, I go into a normal bed, someone else rolls through. But if you're intubating people for a couple of weeks, and we've been hearing more about this on the radio, I think, in recent weeks, particularly because it's starting to become an issue in Sydney, then that hospitalisation and ICU capacity ends up being the constraint, and it's actually really hard to increase it. because it's not a case of just like buying a bunch of ventilators from Japan or China. The constraint is actually people. ICU has one nurse per one person who's in ICU. Maybe you can stretch it to two. And they're really hard to train. So, if we expand ICU capacity, the way we'll probably do it is to get like a bunch of anaesthetists to act as ICU nurses. Like, it's not something you can expand very easily. And I think this hasn't been at the forefront of the conversation until recently, because the conversation has been like, well, look, we should just reopen. Everyone should go back to normal. If you're not vaccinated, you're on your own. And that's kind of how I thought about it a couple of months ago before we started doing this more recent work. So the report we put out, it now feels like forever ago. It was a month ago. It was called Race to 80. 80% of the total population being vaccinated, not 80% of eligible adults, which is what the government's aiming for. Is I thought before that, yeah, we're in a world where, look, you're on your own. But the trouble is that the constraint ends up being, I've got a COVID vaccine, so that's okay. But I have a car accident and there's no hospital bed for me.
Yeah.
And that actually ends up being the problem and the constraint that governments in Australia are trying to work to. And you can see that playing out right now with the plan.
I've got a question on the strategy of zero COVID, right, which worked with previous strains. It seems to me that, the cat's out of the bag, certainly in New South Wales and Sydney, definitely in New South Wales too. It sort of got to a certain point. If you didn't crunch it quickly enough, they basically... once Delta's out, it's out. It seems to be that you can't control it. Now, clearly I'm not an expert, I'm just an observer. But would that be fair to say? Because even looking at Victoria's, Melbourne's shutdowns, I mean, Dan's been very famous for not wasting any time. And even looking at New Zealand, it closed with one case, and they've still got quite a lot of cases. And you think, sure, is it too late? Is COVID zero now a thing of the past, regardless? I mean, except for WA, of course. Is this a reality that we have to vaccinate anyway because there's no longer a choice?
Well, so back in the day, Veronica, the strategy was always not zero COVID forever. The strategy was zero COVID because it was the best of the bad lot of situations until we get the vaccine coverage high enough. And then you open the borders and you don't care. Like, that was certainly when we wrote Race to 80, which was only a month ago. That's how we thought about it. Because we had essentially zero COVID in Australia. We had a small outbreak in New South Wales and they'd done pretty well dealing with other outbreaks in the past. But the short answer is yes, Victoria's in fact just today announced that they're going to actually not go for zero anymore in the last hour, basically because the writing's on the wall. The zero COVID strategy is the most effective the smaller the jurisdiction, right? That's something that I think people are forgetting, is that the reason why Tassie can do it, or WA or South Australia, particularly Tassie, is because when you've only got 300,000, 400,000 people, it only takes one person crossing the border for COVID to come back in. And so if you've only got 5,000 people coming in over the course of a year, that's a lot safer than if you've got 40,000 coming in over the course of the year. It's kind of like, well, zero COVID was never going to work as well in, say, the United States. It worked better for us. So I think we are, unfortunately, what it does show is that by not making the investments we should have made in actually setting up quarantine properly, have really come back to bite us on the ass. Like, building separate quarantine facilities that are completely outside of the city, but close enough to a hospital. Like the COVID facility, the quarantine facility in Darwin, has not had a single outbreak.
Yeah.
And that tells you a lot. That tells you if you'd built 5 of them in each of our major cities, not in them, but so, for example, in Victoria, we could have put it at Avalon, for example. You walk off the plane, you walk to an open-air cabin, you hop in that cabin, you're there for 2 weeks, you walk out and go home, would have been, whatever that was going to cost, which was maybe $1 billion, would have paid itself, 1 week of lockdown would have paid for that. And it is this weird world where we've decided not to make choices that had enormous payoffs. And instead, that's where we find ourselves in this situation. So in Victoria, I don't think we won't be done until we hit the vaccine targets. Now, we'll talk about the vaccine targets in a sec, but that's at least a couple of months away.
Do you think that, 70%, for example, let's say, we'll get there pretty easily, 75%, pretty confident, but every percentage point's going to get really tough after a certain point? And do you have any idea of when it's really going to slow down, the pressure's going to start to really build on trying to get more people through? Do you think it's 75%? Do you think it's 78% where things are going to really slow down?
So there's only about 10% of people, maybe slightly less of adults, that say, I really don't want to get a COVID vaccine. So 90% say, yeah, I'll get it. Now, a lot of them, quite a large proportion, say 20% say, oh, I'll get it, but just kind of not right now. I suspect that number's going down because, you know, in a world where like you've kind of got no COVID, there's no cost to you to not get the vaccine. You're not sure about it. You know, it felt like it happened quickly. You know, we have enough evidence now to say that they're pretty safe, particularly given the alternative of catching COVID in a world where the restrictions aren't in place. But so if you're looking, I think a lot of the conversation has been influenced a lot by what happened in Israel. So Israel got out of the blocks first. You know, they hit 60% vaccine coverage really quickly. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu was on the phone to Pfizer every week. Basically the military ran the whole show. And they flattened out at 60% vaccine coverage. And that seems to have influenced the public discussion about what's possible. But, you know, you look at now, Portugal's at 85% of people have had first doses. Right. Singapore's at 78. Canada's at 73. Denmark's at 76. France is at 71. The UK is at 70. Israel's at 68. So, like, you can clearly hit 80, I think. And that's not allowing kids yet under the age of 12 to get the vaccine coverage. So on our numbers, sort of for what we thought was possible, one is we should be aiming for 80% vaccine coverage of the whole population. And the reason is it's about uncertainty. So we don't really know how infectious Delta is because you never get a random experiment where Delta just shows up and no one reacts. You've always got public health measures. You've always got all these other things. So trying to estimate how effective Delta is in the wild is really hard. And so you've kind of got a range. And the range is kind of between, you know, effective rates of, say 4 to 6. So if we're thinking about like non-restrictive restrictions being in place, like non-invasive ones, like maybe you wear a mask in the supermarket, but nothing else. And so what we found is you had to, if you reopening or relaxing restrictions is kind of a one-shot game. You only get one go at it. So like New South Wales has kind of run out, unfortunately, of space. So you can't experiment anymore because you're at 1,000 cases a day. Melbourne is at 100. You can experiment a little bit and not blow it up. If you're at 1 case a day, you've got a lot more space. And so if you relaxed your approach and sort of said, look, we're going to open up and cases explode, you're never going to get it back down in Sydney, right, if that happens. So you've got to be conservative about when you reopen things because it can get out of hand really quickly because your base rate's 1,000 cases. And I'm saying this in lockdown in Melbourne, right? Like, it's not as if it's like we're saying this not in the same jurisdiction, like in the same situation. And we went through it last year in Melbourne.
So you're saying then that say somewhere in Brisbane, for instance, has got a better chance of actually being freer. Well, they're freer now, but that's only because they don't have any cases, but of being freer sooner if they get their vaccination rates up than Sydney does, or Melbourne even for that matter, but definitely Sydney, purely because if that curve that the modelling has been done on, it starts at, I keep hearing about this 1 case and 30 cases, you know, so that we're just so far along that curve that even though you just pick it up at wherever we are in terms of what can happen, there's just no room for error.
That's right. So, you know, pretty much everyone I suspect has heard of like the reproduction number by now. You can't have gone 18 months into the pandemic without having at least heard of it.
People have gone along without hearing anything that's actually vaguely scientific.
I'm putting a lot of faith in you know the your listeners being relatively
informed,
because they're listening to this podcast.
Have heard of this. Yes.
So they've got to be smart. They're at least thinking with a data-driven approach a bit more than the average person. You know, and so. You know, what we're talking about here is a reproduction rate. It takes about 5 days to incubate. And so if the reproduction rate's 1.2, that means I'll make it 2. Reproduction rate of 2 means first you have 5 cases, 5 days later you have 10. 5 days later you have 20, 5 days later you have 40. So exponential growth, it goes really quick. But even a reproduction rate of 1.2 or 1.3, which is what you got in Sydney, has allowed cases to go from like 100 a day to 1,000 a day over the course of a few weeks. And if that stays on that path, then you're at 6,000 a day or 7. And that's not a forecast. But, you know, that's kind of what that means, right?
When you say that's funny, though, because what I've realised is I used to think an epidemiologist was like a medical person, but they're actually a mathematician.
That's right. It's all about just the power of exponential growth in... You know, the old stories of the lily pond and like there's lilies growing over the pond and they double every day. And if you only make decision the day before when half the lilies are covering the pond, you've got 1 day to sort it out. Otherwise, they cover the whole thing.
So, Brendan, I mean, I think, say we get to 80, which is a good goal, right? And that's the goal we should be aiming for. But, you know, from what I'm seeing is the 70% just keeps on getting banded about. And I think society's getting coded that at 70%, everything's going to be back to normal a little bit. From what I understand, the UK, you just said, is at 70%, and they have sort of let it go. You got full crowds at the football, for example. You got festivals. Societies, let it go. I mean, are they just not worrying about the ICU risk? Is that sort of, they're just sort of saying, we've just got to, our freedom matters more. Who cares if, our ICU beds get filled up? Is that what they're sort of saying over there?
No. So what's interesting there is their version of the ABS, their statistical agency, the ONS, did a serology survey where they tested a bunch of people's blood, and they worked out that 92% of UK adults have COVID antibodies.
Right.
So that means at the time, maybe 60% were vaccinated, and the other 30% got it the hard way.
Wow.
What that means is, if all else equal, if we reopened at something like 60%, you would find 20% of people get it the hard way. And it means that what we do is we just delay all the costs and the pain of an out of control epidemic for 18 months and then experience them anyway.
So is not getting COVID through society going to come back to bite us a little bit right here? We're going to have to be in lockdowns for longer. Yes, we got more freedoms at the start, but we're going to get burned on the end because we never actually got COVID out in the community. Is that sort of what's happening here?
No, well, I think a bit, what it meant is that we needed to really buy vaccines and have a faster vaccine rollout than other countries because we're even more exposed.
Yeah.
And, we've had that opportunity. We had that opportunity, and it is, frankly, the biggest public policy failure that I've ever seen,
Is it enough to make him lose the election?
That's a good question. It kind of depends. I reckon, ask me, let's talk about that. I'm happy to talk about it, but I think you talk about it once you've sketched out what the next couple of months are like, and I'll ask you what you guys think at that point too.
Yeah.
I fear that I'm in my bubble, because I know people think I'm a big lefty, right? But I actually am not. I'm a swinging voter, and I'm swinging way away from Morrison. And it's not just because of this. It's because I think Pentecostal Christians are pacifists, i.e. they're sitting around waiting for God to solve the problem. And I think that sort of typifies the way Morrison does everything. So we've actually had comments that we shouldn't get political.
Yeah, I was going to say, Veronica, we're going to get another 1 star here for going political. But
it's really because I dislike Pentecostal Christians more than I dislike politicians.
But while we're here, though, Brendan, I mean, one of the things that Labor were going to the election was the negative gear policy, and they sort of put that one in the bin. What was your thoughts on that? And their policies going into the next election while we're at this point.
Look, that's a really interesting question. We were a supporter of getting away with negative gearing, or the capital gains tax discount mattered more.
Yeah.
Look, what I would observe from that is, we looked at the polling and we looked at the Australian Electoral Survey, and we couldn't find a lot of evidence that it really hurt Labor at the last election, because the electorates that were most affected swung towards Labor, and it was lower income electorates that swung towards the coalition, right? That said, there is a difference in a narrative. I'm a policy person, but I observe politics. There's a difference in a narrative that says we're going to drop negative gearing when house prices are rising, which is what happened in 2016, and a narrative that said we're going to drop negative gearing when house prices are falling, which would happen in 2019. And keeping that is the challenge when you're in opposition. You have a set of policies. I think, from what I can tell, it definitely helped them in 2016 electorally. You keep those policies into 2019, and they just had so many. I think. We're non-partisan. We don't take a side in the fight per se. We do talk about the policy, so we play the policy, not the man. And in this instance, what just really struck me is just how many policies Labor had. We were struggling to keep track of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So now it's about simplifying their message for the next one, and maybe just pick on ScoMo is probably going to be easy after. So, I mean, what are some of the major hurdles you think about actually achieving this 80%? Besides a better vaccine rollout, what are some of the changes of perception in society? What are some of the things that we really need to work on to hit this number?
So it really is honestly just about the vaccine rollout, in the sense that, I think there's two things. One is it's about the vaccine rollout largely, and then it's also about a challenge of accepting COVID in the community. We 1,000% have to live with COVID. That is the world that we're moving towards. The thing is that vaccine coverage allows us to do that. So I'm just getting shade on me from the light outside. So the challenge here is, first of all, okay, do we have enough doses? The answer is clearly yes. Like, we will be drowning in Pfizer in 2 months' time. We have enough vaccines to vaccinate everyone just with Pfizer alone by the end of the year. So that's not going to be a problem. The challenge is actually kids. Now, this is where it's really tricky. Is we say 80%, and the reason we say that is when I was talking before about the reproduction rates. If the reproduction rate's on the high side, then you need 80% to avoid sort of having it blow up and blowing up your hospital system. Because if it gets out of hand, this is really important, is if it gets out of hand, your hospitals basically are out of action for 3 months. Because what would happen is you would do what we're doing now. You would lock down before you get there, and then it's just a longer lockdown. This is why we always said COVID zero, because the alternative of letting it go ended up with a political response anyway, and then you're in a longer lockdown for longer. So it is about hitting that 80% number. We think that's the sort of number the government should be aiming for. Now, the National Cabinet Plan is not 80% of the population, and I think this is getting lost in the debate. It's 80% of eligible adults.
Yes, so what is that of the whole population?
So 70% of eligible adults is about 55%.
Right.
And 80% of eligible adults is about 65%. So more or less.
Yeah.
So they're actually aiming for a much lower number than we are. And on our numbers, it looks like there's problems when you hit that open at those lower numbers. It's much riskier. Now, it may be fine. Maybe you reopen and we find out the reproduction number was lower than we thought. But as I said, it's a one-shot game. So if you get it wrong, you don't get a second bite of the cherry. Like then you're in the UK or the London-style world, the New York world, where things are running away from you. So
what makes you ineligible? So eligible adults.
So 16 and up at the moment is the population that they framed the vaccine targets around. We've now just opened it up to 12-year-olds, I think. But the target is definitely 80% of 16 and plus, because that was who was eligible at the point when they set the targets. Now, the challenge is kids. So we think you could get there by the end of the year if you have a vaccine available for kids over 5. Now, that's tricky and the reason it matters is because kids don't get sick that often, but they are vectors for transmission. That is how it jumps between households, if I can put it that way. In the same way as essential workers are the way it's jumping between households now in Sydney.
Yeah.
And so if you can't get a vaccine for kids, you are looking at more like March.
But can it be a vaccine for even 5-year-olds too old? I mean, my daughter's 2 and she's a nuclear weapon. Like if she's out going to daycare or anything like that, she brings home something and then our household blows up. So does it need to be from babies, like as well? Like if you're really going to stop this?
So on our work, we would suggest if you get 80% of everyone, including kids, it doesn't matter. In the same way as if you would still get outbreaks. Like you'll still get it becomes more like something like the measles, right? Like it's something that happens. You isolate for a few days if you get it, but the whole school doesn't shut down. Now, that said, no, but when I say, March next year, everyone goes, oh, Jesus, are we going to be in this world until March? And the answer is not quite, right? But it depends on where you are. Because as the vaccine coverage increases, the reproduction rate falls. So maybe what's going to happen now is states are going to, and this is what Victoria's signalled, as the vaccine coverage goes up, and Gladys has done this in New South Wales as well, you will gradually relax restrictions with an aim of keeping the reproduction rate at 1 or below.
Right.
Now, Gladys thought we would be able to do more things. Instead, it's what you can go for a picnic outside with 5 people. I know it's not a lot.
I'd rather go to my hairdresser.
I'd rather my kids go to childcare, And the challenge is that each one of those things, it's almost like a budget. You've got a budget for the reproduction rate in the community, and you've got to keep it sort of at that level. And New South Wales really has to keep it at 1. And they're struggling to keep it at 1 now when everything's shut. Which is problematic. Like, I think it's a really tough situation. There's not really a way out, because if they relax restrictions much and it goes from 1.1 to 1.5 reproduction, you go from 1,000 cases to like 10,000 pretty quick. And that's not good.
I feel like the ultimate host here, because I can ask silly questions, which is what a good host can do. Is the questions that listeners are thinking regarding when it's not. But what about these top-up and boosters? Because are we going to get to this 70 or 80%, and then that starts to, lose its impact, and then we're going to have to start hitting boosters, every 6 months? Because I mean, I've only read a tiny little bit, and that's what I'm hearing is that, these things start to run out of steam pretty quick.
Yeah, so what's interesting is we've demonised a bit AstraZeneca in Australia, which I think has been really unfortunate, and one of the bigger policy mistakes that we've made.
Yeah.
Is AstraZeneca actually holds its potency for longer. So by month 4, the expectation is AstraZeneca will be more effective than Pfizer.
Wow.
Because it's just about the way the vaccines are made. Like, I don't know. I only read what I read. I'm not an expert in any of that stuff. Economists are very good at speaking outside our lane generally, but there are limits even to what I'm willing to go. The short answer, Chris, is you're going to look at boosters. Israel's already rolling them out. The US are too. I suspect we've bought enough. This time we've.
Right.
Yeah, we have bought enough to do that for next year. It is challenging ethically, globally, because there's a whole bunch of countries where, only 35% of the world is vaccinated. A bunch of, I used to live in Indonesia, like the vaccine coverage there's really low. It's been pretty bad.
Also, there's been an issue. There's an issue that they've been, is it Sinovac, the Chinese vaccination, doesn't appear, well, the vaccine I should say, doesn't appear to be as effective as the others. So
that appears to be the case, from what we can tell. If the expectation was a year ago, if we got a vaccine as effective as Sinovac, we would have been ecstatic, right? As it turns out, we've got ones that are really good. Like AstraZeneca is like really effective at what it does. And if that was the only vaccine we had, we would be using it. And instead, we've kind of ended up in this kind of mad world where people are not using AZ. They're waiting for Pfizer. I think that is, something that's worth thinking about. Public health hasn't been perfect during this period. We've made a lot of mistakes. The government's going to make heaps of mistakes when it's having to intervene in society as much as it has. But that is a big one for me. Like the fact that that ATAGI which is basically the expert group, recommended against AZ for under 60s. I think was a huge mistake.
So I was one of those under 60s that got AstraZeneca. And I was actually booked for my second dose on this Friday. And my mother-in-law was like, hang on a sec, how did you get your first dose only 4 weeks ago? And you're getting your second dose, like literally after 4 weeks. And I could book it on the app. And I did some reading last night, and I'm meant to be waiting 8 weeks. And so I would have got through the cracks and got it booked with a 4-week gap. And so if I can do it within 4 weeks, is this going to be our next stuff up where the people getting their AstraZeneca is going to be too soon than what, because we're just trying to rush everyone through. So I moved mine to 8 weeks, which, but I could have done it in 4 weeks. So I just don't get what's going on. Do you know?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is that when we do these trials, right, like you basically, the drug company has to decide roughly what length of time they think they're going to need to run this large-scale trial that they only get one shot at, right, and then they come back later. And so, they went with a 12-week dosage. I think they actually, with AstraZeneca, other places went with a shorter dosage, and we actually worked out that longer was better. I'm pretty sure the advice in New South Wales, and look, I'm not a medical professional, I'm pretty sure the advice in New South Wales has been to bring forward your second dose. Because it might be like, you might be 88% effective at 4 weeks, maybe it's 93 at 8 weeks, maybe it's 95 at 12 weeks. And at the moment, they just want everyone vaccinated because it's spreading through the community. So, people have got to make their own choices. But, I think that's why you can do it at 4 weeks. I think it is actually... I think there's less science about the dosage numbers. Like there's actually some interesting research that says you could have done half doses of Pfizer and it's almost as effective. In which case we could have vaccinated twice as many people by now. But we've been in a world where we've asked people to be so flexible, our institutional arrangements that govern how we approach sort of health regulation particularly have not been flexible at all. They've taken months to approve vaccines in Australia that are already being used with 100 million doses abroad. It's kind of like if you already know it's being used abroad.
So I guess people who think it's a conspiracy of the pharmaceutical companies in cohorts with the government, need to hear that. But, because the data you mentioned earlier it suggests to me that there's about 10% of anti-vaxxers out there, committed anti-vaxxers that will not have the vaccine regardless. Is that fair to say from what you're...
Yeah, that's what they say. They don't want to take it. Now, how anti-vax they are, like whether they're going to go post on their local Facebook group or they're just not going to get around to getting an appointment is unclear, right?
Do they have any power? You know, I mean, in the sense that, are they holding any of us to ransom? I mean, if there's 10%, you know, does it matter once we get to 90%? I know we've been talking about 70%, 80% and 55%, 65%. You know, if 10% of the population just dig their heels in and say, no way, will it really become a disease of the unvaccinated in that, you know, the way I think Joe Biden has called it? But are they in any way influencing what's happening at the moment?
Well, they are to the extent that we're not as far along the curve as what we would be if they were open to getting the vaccine. You know, I can understand at sort of like a base intuitive level that if you're not following this really closely and it's like, Jesus, we didn't think we'd have vaccines and now we do. Like, is there something weird going on? Maybe your trust in government is less. Like, you know, the role I have, I talk to politicians all the time. You know, we're trying to advise them on policy. And so, you know, I have I have my eyes open about the bad things about how politics works, but I have enough faith in other institutions.
If you like what you're hearing here, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars, please. Every review helps make it easier for other people to find us and hear what our amazing guests have to say. We love hearing your questions and we're planning more listener Q&A episodes. Please send your questions in. You can send them via the website, which is theelephantintheroom.com.au, or directly via email to questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au.
Where we're going to end up, though, Veronica, is a world where this is why things like vaccine passports, you know, domestic restrictions, that freedom's only being given to the vaccinated and not to the undervaccinated. That's kind of why we're heading in that direction. Because in a normal world, you would say, look, your body, your choice.
Yeah.
In this world, we're saying, well, although we do things like you can't get childcare benefits if sending kids to childcare unless they're vaccinated. In this world, we are literally locking down all of society and forcing people to stay in their homes. So you're not going to mandate that you have to have the vaccine. I think that's probably a stretch too far. But what you will do is say, well, you can't go to a cafe, you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to the footy, you can't go to a bar unless you.
Well, they try policing that if you're a small cafe or restaurant. You know, a pub maybe has got a security guard. Certainly, the football oval. You know, the footy, the grounds. It's going to be interesting to manage that. But I'm curious to know also, what do you say to people who think that by prioritising health over the economy, which is effectively what we have done, right, we've actually caused more of a mental health problem?
So I think there's a real failing at times of counterfactual thinking here. It's kind of like we're in lockdown and we're attributing all the costs of lockdown to the strategy. And it's like, no. COVID is this really crappy thing that's happened to us all. And so what would life look like if we hadn't have locked down? Like, I think the economic cost, well, we know from certainly looking at some of the early studies of, say, Sweden versus other places, that the countries that follow the Australian approach have actually had the best of both worlds. We've had fewer deaths. We've actually had less of an economic disruption. Now, that's because it's COVID zero, and you can kind of, if you're in Perth right now, like, what's COVID? Like, you can't go to Bali, but apart from that, your life is pretty much normal. And I mean that seriously, not in a disparaging way. Like, it is an incredible achievement.
Well, it was like that in Sydney until, you know, June.
Yeah, like Victorians kind of got a bit of the rough end of the stick in the Australian context where we haven't quite had it quite to the same degree. But if you're in most of Australia, like life is better here than it has been anywhere else as far as dealing with COVID goes. And so, you know, unmitigated spread of COVID is probably worse for the economy. That's the Treasury's view when they did modelling along with Doherty Institute for the National Cabinet discussions. So we've probably done better. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't costs, but like a lot of those costs that are existing under lockdowns, a lot of those same costs are existing in a world of unmitigated spread, because in a world where there's no vaccine, like, you're not going out anywhere anyway because, you know, it's spreading like wildfire. If you do get sick, you can't go to hospital. If you have a car accident, you can't go to hospital. Like, you know, life's pretty hard. So, you know, I think there's a debate that we should debate these questions. The mental health stuff is, I think, a real thing, and we should worry a lot about that. And the duration of it matters. It's why investing in vaccines and everything else was so important and such a huge failure. Because at this point, we could probably not be in lockdown if it wasn't for vaccines. I don't think Sydney would be anywhere near the position it's in now if we'd got the vaccine rollout up and running, even at the pace of like the UK or Canada or France or our normal comparator countries that are wealthy and normally well-governed or relatively well-governed.
Yeah.
So Brendan, on an economy point of view, what are some of the things that we're going to look back on 2020, 2021, 2022 and say, like, that's when we lost the Holden, that's when we lost part of our economy to COVID. Is there going to be some sectors or some industries or certain parts of small business that you think just won't ever come back from these, and things have moved on? Like working from home, it's been a massive shift, and I don't think we're going to go back to 5 days in the office. I might be wrong, but is there going to be other things where you think the economy's really pivoted and think people are going to get really hurt?
Yeah, so last year, I was on the podcast, I think, talking about some of our employment projections early on, which turned out to be completely wrong, and I'm really grateful that they did. And I'm happy to acknowledge that, because any good, decent pundit should at least acknowledge when they did get it wrong. Yeah. And we did.
You will get a gold star in our full forecaster report for next year.
Never trust me again. Like, I've learned that just not to make forecasts is the best way to do it. No, and we normally aren't in the forecasting game as much as, say, some of your other your guests on the podcast. But I think the big problem right now is last year we paid people to stay at home, and it wasn't perfect, but it worked pretty well. Yeah. There was some, Jerry Harvard's paid back his $6 million from Harvey Norman on JobKeeper in the last couple of days.
What was he paid? Is that all of what he was paid?
No, I think it was only what was paid to his stores, and then there's obviously the franchises that he doesn't own.
Got it.
But, there was always going to be a bunch of waste, and I don't think we should look back at that as, like, maybe we could have done a better job, but it's pretty hard to. Like, I helped design the '08 stimulus, and, like, literally we did it in a weekend, right? Like, that's just how things work.
Speed is important, isn't it, at that point? It's a crisis. You need help then, right?
That's right. And, I remember at the time, like, it used to be a great story to say I'd spent $10 billion in a weekend. And now I know the guys that actually designed JobKeeper, and they're just like, that's not much of a story anymore. Like, we lost $70 billion down the back of a couch. Like,
I mean, while you're there, Brendan, what is the debt impact, though? Like, let's say like most sectors come back, right? And maybe some businesses don't survive. And I really do feel it's a really story that's getting lost at the moment is the small business impact that is, growing for a lot of society. But what is the government sort of credit card bill sort of risen that we're going to really have to pay back? And how long is that going to take us? Because that's really one of the costs that we can't run away from, right?
Yeah, so, like, we've obviously accumulated a bunch of debt. What's interesting is the interest cost on that debt is less now than what it was before COVID.
Yeah.
It kind of depends on what you think is going to happen to interest rates. And I think most economists will tell you now that secular stagnation is a real thing. Larry Summers, basically, there's global inequality and aging population means that interest rates, there's too much savings and not enough investment as demand for those savings, which means interest rates have fallen. I don't think that world's going away anytime soon. So look, there's a forecast for your listeners. And so, in that world, then, like, the debt is kind of sustainable. Like, we are in a world where, there's an opportunity cost. You're giving up spending that money on something else, but I think we spent it on the right thing, i.e. we spent it to keep the economy whole while we locked down and went through this mess. But I think the long-term costs of that are actually not as big as people think.
Yeah.
There is a medium-term fiscal challenge in Australia in the context that the population's aging. Now, you could deal with that by raising taxes. You could deal with that by cutting spending. Those are both politically difficult. So it's not an unsolvable problem, but it's the actual underlying economic costs of it are not that high, and certainly nowhere near as high as the next best option, which would have been to not pay people, which would have been far worse. The bigger problem, Chris, at the moment is we're really not paying people anywhere near as much as we were last year. And I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago with small businesses, and it was, they've basically been thrown under the bus, and they're having to incur the costs themselves on their own balance sheets that last year we shared across the community. And I don't understand why we're making different choices now. Partly it's politics. The government clearly doesn't want JobKeeper to return because it would remind everyone of the overspending on some things. But we in a world where we're requiring for everyone to stay at home for months at a time, morally, you can't expect small businesses and workers to bear that cost on their own balance sheets. That's something we should be sharing across the community more. And I don't really understand the logic where we're being spendthrift on that right now. The economic costs of not doing it will be much higher. So the parts you asked before about what are the parts of the economy that might, struggle, I think if you're working in commercial office space, your things are not looking great because, I don't expect to go back to work 5 days a week in the office. In fact, I'm probably going to buy a bigger house instead so I can work from home. So you've got sectors like that are going to struggle. We're not really going to get back into a world where international travel is going to be going gangbusters again until sometime next year. So that's going to hurt, I suspect, as well, those businesses that rely on international tourism. So anyone in North Queensland, travel agents, flight businesses and so on. Like, you're taking this hit to your balance sheet that's maybe the economy. Like, I think what we've learned in the last year is the economy is pretty resilient. Like, it bounced back much quicker than we all thought, or I think most people thought. And the reason for that is because we paid people to sort of preserve it, to snap freeze it, and then when we thought it out, things were kind of okay. So I think the long-term economic costs are probably going to be less than you think. The structural change will occur, but it's kind of still hard to predict what that looks like, apart from I wouldn't go and investing in commercial office space anytime soon.
You said the things we can get away from that aging population is spend more or, take more taxes. But what about migration, right? What about us just going on the next baby boom, but instead of a baby boom, it's like a import people boom? Do you think that that's going to be, the next 5-10 years, is we're just going to go nuts on migration?
Well, the government's pitched for they're going to increase the permanent migrant intake from 160 a year back up to 190 in a couple of years' time. That's in the intergenerational report, the most recent one. The short answer is, like, you could imagine that happening. Like, the challenge is going to be, and so part of my work program is migration. We just released a report on permanent migration a couple of months ago. And, there is a big fiscal benefit from migration, not in the sense that migrants, particularly, they tend to be wealthier, they tend to pay more tax than they draw in services, and there's a long-term fiscal dividend, and that dividend can actually be pretty big for bringing in people that are quite skilled, which is what most of our program is. So I suspect that's another way. You can also grow the pie by growing the economy. Like, that's obviously, they're kind of the four strategies you've got. So migration is a way of growing the size of the economy. I would expect, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said Australia's going to emerge from this a much more attractive destination for migration than anywhere else. I'm not so sure now, because our the way we've treated migrants in Australia hasn't been fantastic. We've excluded them from these programs like JobKeeper when other countries didn't. The borders are still shut and look like they're going to be shut in Australia longer than anywhere else, basically. And so I find it really hard to predict, but we're not going to be out of this for a while yet. And I do want to touch briefly on the sort of the national plan that.
Yeah, but before we get to that, though, because sort of going back to, the people that are bearing the brunt of this new wave of lockdowns, mostly, small business and the employees that are losing their jobs or on stand down and not being supported in the same way that they were before, right? And then there's social uprising. Did I read somewhere there was like 60 protests or something across the country on the weekend or something? I mean, they might be small, but people are really there's a bit of an underswell. And then, of course, if you're talking about increasing migrant intake, because there's this perception they're taking our jobs, so does that all feed into that gap, I guess, between the haves and the have-nots? And we can put this back in property just for a minute, because the reality is that obviously property prices rising, the opportunity to get into the market is getting further and further away for people who don't have a property. Is that something that the government, do you think, is paying attention to, that the potential for that sort of social unrest as a result of inequality?
Well, I think the social unrest at the moment, and people are frustrated with being locked down. It's pretty reasonable. I understand why people are feeling that way, particularly if your livelihood, is not being protected in the same way as what it was last year.
Yeah.
So if your livelihood was being protected, and maybe even you're getting a little bit more than you would have because JobKeeper was a bit more generous than what you were getting before, I think that was fine, because you're basically paying people to stay at home. You're sort of accepting this is a cost we're making you incur. Like, look, I can do my job from home. Like, I'm pretty lucky about it. As long as childcare's open, which isn't always the case, then, but I'm pretty well off compared to most people in how I'm having to deal with this situation. But if you're running a business and like the work of 10 years is going down the drain, I can kind of understand why you would get really frustrated in that way. But what the policy failure there isn't end lockdowns, because I think that would be worse. unfortunately, the policy failure is we're not paying people to do, what we're really asking them to do. We're not coming to the party and to the table morally the same way we were last year. So there's less of a sense we're all in this together, because in some respects we're not.
But not only that, but there's also a bit of a misinformation, I think, around whether there's going to be continued lockdowns or not. It's 70%, 80% vaccinated. Plan phase B and phase C. It's like that's sort of in the fine print. And, I think if people are feeling pretty pissed off now, then they line up, get vaccinated, thinking that's our passport out of here, and all of a sudden we're able to get back on with life, and then finding, oh, hang on a minute, still can't. That's not going to be very popular, is it?
Yeah, I think that's a real mistake that governments are making, and I can understand how the politics can lead to the outcome that we've got, which is that the vaccine rollout has been ineffective, and we're sort of aiming to reassure people there'll be some freedoms coming. The problem is, as we sort of talked about all along, the vaccine targets for people. A lot of people that I talk to tend to think that when we hit 80%, everything goes back to normal. But that's not what the national plan says.
Yeah, this is the juicy bit, right?
Yeah, so the national plan does not say when we hit 80%, things are fine. The national plan assumes that, based on the work that Doherty's done in particular, you're assuming that you've got some level of baseline community restrictions. Like there are floor density limits going on in a permanent level. There are still restrictions on inbound and outbound travel. Lockdowns are not off the table, and in our work, it would seem to suggest that lockdowns are fairly likely. Or at least, the threshold question is, can you, at 70% vaccine coverage or 80% vaccine coverage of the eligible population, so that's 65% of the whole population, can you have schools open and childcare open and keep the reproduction rate below 1? Like, we don't kind of know that yet, right? And so what Doherty has done is only model phase B. So there are 4 stat phases. Phase A is where we are. Continue to strongly suppress the virus. Well, look, we're not doing that as well as we were when the plan was made a month ago. Phase B is minimise serious illness and death from COVID with low-level restrictions, and expecting that, lockdowns are less likely but possible. Phase C, when we hit 80% eligible population, is live with the virus, minimise serious illness and death. We still keep baseline restrictions in place. We still have lockdowns. We still have restrictions on a bunch of things. And then phase D is when everything reopens. Now, Grattan just modelled phase D, and we think you need 80% of the whole population. And even 80% is not possibly not enough. At that point, if you're starting at 0 cases, then the ref starts above 1, but your vaccine coverage keeps going up, so that you outrun the virus in a sense. So when the government is saying 70% you'll get some freedoms, 80% you get some freedoms, particularly when COVID's in the community, which makes the task harder, you're probably looking at less restrictions. You're looking at the kind of rules that Victoria and New South Wales are rolling out now, which is that you gradually open up, test which things kick it above 1, but like schools are a big source of transmission, childcare's a source of transmission. So it doesn't mean things go back to normal. And I think people are expecting that it's going to be, and they're going to be really pissed off when it's not. And the politics come down to, who do you blame? Do you blame Scott Morrison for the vaccine rollout? Or do you blame the states that are the ones that are fronting press conferences saying what you can and can't do every day? And that's, I think, I don't think we quite know what the politics is going to look like.
So do you think there's going to be a massive budget spend next year? Because when will the election be? Well, the election will probably be, he can do it before or after, can't he?
It's got to be by May, I think, was the last time that they can go to an election, which means the election itself could be... I'm not sure if the election has to be in May, or it can be called in May for June.
Yeah. So the budget's going to be before that, right?
Well, budget's normally in May, but we sometimes move it forward, sometimes we push it back. You can do whatever you want. It's just a convention.
So do you think that, though, just sort of forecasting next year, do you think that we're probably still going to be living with the virus, probably still going to be living with lockdowns next year? We may get to that 80-90% range by March sort of time. What are you thinking?
So we're, based on current trends, we'll hit 80% of the 16 plus population, in mid-November. New South Wales will get there earlier. Now, that's partly because you've got COVID and therefore you're going getting vaccinated. It's partly because more Pfizer doses are being shipped to New South Wales than elsewhere. That means you could hit 80% by the end of the year, I think. If things keep going the way they are, I think we should be able to hit 80 by the end of the year. I suspect you'll probably see more mandates of you can't go to the restaurant or the footy unless you're vaccinated, and that will actually be the thing that pushes the vaccine rates up, and that's justified. Then you're going into 2022.
Do you reckon you can go travel regionally though? Can I go to the South Coast? Like, do you think at 80%, or do you reckon it'll still be a city LGA lockdowns?
You mean 80% of the government's targets?
Yeah.
I think Chris, it kind of depends where the numbers are at. Because if the numbers are at 10,000 or 5,000 cases a day, and like, again, these aren't forecasts, this is just speculation. If the numbers were high at that point, then it's really hard, because if you allow people to move around more, then the reproduction rate rises and you might be worried about your hospitals. If the numbers are more like where they are now, then possibly, yes, you don't worry so much anymore. We haven't done that work. I suspect Doherty is going to have to do that work for the government in the next little bit.
Yeah.
So I suppose my only thing I can say is it's not going to look like a full reopening when we hit those 80% numbers.
Yeah.
It's going to look like something a bit more relaxed, much more strict than that. And I would prioritise schools and childcare over everything else, because you can pay people to not run their restaurant. You can't pay a kid for the lost learning of not being in schools, and that's a big problem.
And also, more people can work from home if their kids are at school, let's face it. So it is interesting because obviously, there's this expectation that I think is allowed by the government to be fostered that, yes, on 70 and 80%, we're going to be almost back to normal. Certainly at 80%, I think a lot of people I talk to, they seem to feel that is, they say it. So... And I do, I listen quite carefully to what is being said by the politicians, and it's a real economy of information and detail. And it's interesting what you say about Doherty hasn't even modelled out phase D, so therefore there's no numbers there to work to, no targets. That's even a bit scary in itself to think that that's the ultimate, living with COVID. That's sort of what it looks like, but we don't know actually what's required to get there. Is that partly because we're still learning as we go? We're observing what's happening overseas and we're sort of testing what's happening here. So it's like to model it now is almost a bit premature.
Yeah, well, look, having gone through an exercise where we modelled it a month ago, assuming 0 cases sort of run more or less through the end of the year, and then we reopened, like, things are looking different. And that's what Doherty said. Like, they've said it's too uncertain to do phase D yet. And also, I think they were only asked by the government to do phase B. So they're only being commissioned by the government to do certain things. On the sort of like the messages from politicians, I think this is kind of this dichotomy between 80% of the eligible population and what that entails, and 80% of the total population and what that entails for your freedoms is what's driving the rhetoric from Queensland and WA. So, they're saying they're not going to relax restrictions at 80%. And if they're at COVID 0 at that point, that's the right call.
Yeah.
You leave it in place until, not forever, who knows what WA is going to do. It does have its own politics and its own identity. But, you're in a world where you probably don't let it in until you get to 80% of the whole population. Now, maybe in 2 months' time, they've got COVID from a truck driver from over east anyway, and it doesn't matter. And we're all gradually, everyone falls like dominoes and ends up in like Victoria and New South Wales. But I think it's unhelpful that they're not being explicit, that they're not having the conversation yet that they're going to have to let it in eventually. Because we have to do that. Like, we can't stay locked down forever. I don't know anyone that genuinely says we should just stay locked down and never re-engage with the world, even though that's the meme that comes from criticism of 0 COVID. It's certainly not what we think. We want to live with COVID, but there's different ways of living with COVID, and not overwhelming your hospital system seems like a pretty good way to me.
So what should the government be doing now? I mean, you go, Veronica, if you want.
Yeah, no, I was just, because, it's interesting you drew that distinction between sort of, the measurement is the ICU beds, not the deaths. Because of course deaths come after the lack of ICU beds anyway, right? So it's just like you don't even want to contemplate what could happen if we don't have the capacity to help those chronically ill patients. but also the knock-on effect of all the people that die of other things that would otherwise have been treated in an ICU bed that's no longer available. And it's funny because one of those arguments you hear from people who were sort of a bit anti-vax, and they're going, oh, you know, all these people dying of COVID, or dying of pneumonia, and it's marked down that they died of COVID because if they had COVID, that's marked as a cause of death. And I'm like, well, what about all the people that died of a car accident but because they couldn't get an ICU bed, and they would have got one had it not been for a COVID patient being in that bed? Does their death get marked down to being due to COVID also? You know, you sort of can't have it both ways, right?
Well, there's a sense to which that sort of anti-lockdown crowd has framed and owned, like, look, there are health displacement costs from being locked down, and saying people aren't going and getting tested for cancer. But those same people wouldn't go and get tested for cancer if the place they were most likely to get COVID was the place they were getting tested for cancer. Like, it's a two-way street.
Exactly. That's
easy way out. So, I mean, besides helping small businesses, like, because what I'm thinking about is probably the economy side of it. I mean, the health side, who knows, right? What's going to happen, and vaccines and rollouts and stuff like that. But how's that sort of going to play into interest rates? How's that going to play into the economy? What's that going to impact our migration and et cetera? What should the government, you know, because Scott Morrison's got the election next year. What should he be really doing here from a policy point of view? Because he's sort of just focusing on this vaccine rollout, but really, should he just be going and spending? I know you're in the policy space. Should he be going spending a lot more cash, doing another type of round of JobKeeper? Should he be doing another funding line to the banks? You know, what should be happening that's not happening at a government level from a, you know, spending point of view?
I think it's fair to say that, like, what the unemployment got down to 4.8 or lower.
Yeah.
You know, it got low before COVID, before the latest lockdowns. So, like, the underlying economy is, like, running around with a bunch of liquidity and looking pretty good. You know, so for what should the government do? Well, look, they could do more now, and that would make the rollout on the other side, the recovery on the other side, faster. That, you know, we don't know where the rate of unemployment is that starts to see inflation rise. My guess is it looks like it's probably got a 3 in front of it rather than a 4. Like, you know, just from what we've seen, like, the US got down to low 3s and unemployment and inflation wasn't rising much there either.
Yeah, right.
So I think we're in a world where you've got more spare capacity in the economy than we realise. So in a sense, there's a payoff to doing more stimulus and more support. You should certainly pay people to stay at home. And if you did that, that's probably enough extra stimulus, because that in itself, if you pay people properly, you are probably talking another 10, 20, $30 billion into the economy over the last 6 months of the year. Like, that would be a lot of money.
Yeah.
You know, you can get 40% of your costs covered. I think it's under JobSaver. For small businesses, it should be 70 or 80. Like, the program should be twice the size. So that itself probably does a lot of the work for you. Like, the RBA saying they're not going to do more, or had been saying they're going to keep tapering off the sort of quantitative easing they'd been doing. You know, I don't understand why you wouldn't keep going in a world when your inflation is still well below your target. Like, they have probably not done as much as they should have over time, and it's hard to explain why they're not doing more when they've got the scope, given that you haven't hit your target and you haven't hit your inflation target for, say, 6 years. Beyond that, though, you know, we obviously want to spend as much as we can. Whatever it takes to get the vaccine coverage up, spend it. But I think sticks are probably going to be more effective than carrots here. So we recommended, like, a lottery, $10 million a week for 10 weeks or for 8 weeks from start of November through the end of the year. So starting on Melbourne Cup Day, because we are Victorians. But, you know, you should do all those things. Beyond that, you probably got to see what the economy looks like. But, you know, we're still a long way from full employment. We're a long way from inflation rising. That's kind of suggesting you got spare capacity you could use. Would stimulus work right now? Just straight up normal stimulus? Probably not as effectively, because people can't go and spend the money. Yeah. It's more about keeping people safe. Keeping their balance sheets secure. Going into next year, I think what'll be interesting is I wouldn't expect rates to rise much, if at all, for a while. The RBA has become much clearer that they will not increase rates until inflation is sustainably back within 2 to 3% and wages are growing. And I feel like we're a while before that happens.
Yeah.
Well, I imagine these most recent lockdowns would have put a bit of a kick in the teeth of that idea anyway, right?
I think so.
And is it just me? I mean, they're pretty much waiting, hoping that the house prices will just sort of, you know, peter off, really, right? They're hoping that the growth will slow down and affordability constraints will kick in, and then that will take the whole pressure off from rising rates just to slow down asset price growth. But And what happens if prices just keep on rising, and affordability just keeps on getting stretched? Do you think that at some point they're going to have to raise rates just to slow down, basically investors start coming back into the market? These things could definitely start to happen if they don't increase rates, and in 2023 or 2024, they're still at zero.
I think we've learned from the last 5 years that strategy of what they call leaning against the wind, which is where you have rates higher than they probably should be to reduce the amount that people borrow and worry about house prices and credit bubbles, is a bad idea. The costs of that strategy are very high because you've got a lot more unemployment than you should have. Wages grow more slowly than they otherwise would have. And ironically enough, balance sheets are often in a worse state because the economy's not been growing as fast as it should have. So, where we've got to is we eventually introduce macroprudential rules. So the basic principle of, monetary policy is if you've got one tool, if you've got one objective, you need one instrument. If you've got two objectives, you need two instruments. And so, you've got a second instrument, which is you can control how much people can borrow, particularly for riskier lending. That would be where I'd expect that they would go if they are worried about risks. Now, at the moment, they're not that worried because it's mainly home buyers, particularly upgraders. I'm the case in point. I'm looking at a house that's more expensive than I was last year because my existing home is now worth more and I've got more equity to play with. They call it a financial accelerator. So if they're going to do anything, it would be on macroprudential. They seem very relaxed about that at the moment, and it's because who's borrowing more money at the moment are probably more secure credits, so they're not worried about the banks. So I don't expect rates to rise. I wouldn't expect that to happen for a while. Macro proves and the Reserve Bank governor has said that they will not do that again. He has said that in his speeches. Where I think things are going to go is we're going to go into next year's election with house prices having risen by 20% plus in Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide. Melbourne's a bit behind, based on the CoreLogic numbers. And so I suspect Labor's not going to want to do something like negative gearing. So what you're probably going to see is a competition about who can do something that sounds good for first home buyers. So can you extend the deposit guarantee scheme? Do you do a shared equity scheme where the government buys part of your house for you? Which the latter is not, there is a policy case you can make for why that's not a terrible idea for people who don't have access to the bank of mum and dad. And things of that nature. I think you're going to have an election that's about about retail politics, about what you can offer that's going to sound good to the electorate, and not things that are probably going to make an enormous difference, because all the things that would make a big difference in our work, they're really hard. It's boosting, relaxing planning rules and attractive places to live, so you get more townhouses and apartments built in the most expensive areas of Sydney and Melbourne. That's hard. Negative gearing and CGT reform for investors, that's pretty hard. Including the home in the assets test for the age pension, that's really hard. They're not easy solutions to actually, if you want to bring prices down and improve affordability. And so you're left in the world that we're at, which is essentially, things that sound good. Some things will make more difference than others. Like the shared equity scheme, I think probably is not a bad idea. But it's tricky. These are the policies I'd expect governments to look at and politicians to look at going into the next election.
Brendan, we've got to ask you, have you got a property dumbo that you want to throw in that you've heard recently? I know you've been on here 4 times, I think. So look, I'm just amazed at the amount of people that will buy it, because in Melbourne you can't do inspections, right? Is the amount of people that will buy a house without ever seeing it. I find the idea that you're going to spend 6 times your annual income buying a house and never see the property, it's just quite confronting. Can you drive past it though?
If you could walk past as part of your hourly exercise.
As long as it's within, 5Ks of where you live.
5Ks, yeah, that's right.
5Ks.
Luckily, the place I'm looking at is 5Ks exactly from my current house.
I think it's because there's permits in New South Wales, isn't there, Veronica? If you wanted to go and look at a property, you can get a permit if it's outside is it LGA?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know about the permits. I do know that as a real estate agent, I'm considered an essential worker, which is fabulous, and so I can go outside my LGA. However, if I was in one of those stricter lockdown LGAs, I couldn't go outside my the LGA. So it does depend on where you are. But I can go into one of those LGAs and then out again. I just can't exit it if I live in that LGA.
Right.
Yeah, and but then, there must be a loophole because you can leave Sydney to go and look for property up in Byron Bay,
Yes.
Famously done, infamously done, I should say. But that's been tightened. Oh, I love the fact that it's been tightened. You're not allowed to leave Sydney. It's amazing. Can't leave Sydney. Oh, but you can go up there looking for an investment property. So that's been tightened. So you can only go up there if you're going to move up there. So, of course, everyone's going to move up there. It's just a bit ridiculous. So I figure then if you're within one of those LGAs, surely if you can go to Byron Bay to look for a property if I'm going to live up there, surely you could go to the next LGA and look at a property if you're going to live there.
Yeah.
So in Victoria, you'll be able to, you can't physically inspect anything, and there are houses selling at the moment,
That is a dumbo without seeing it. Massive dumbo.
From 23rd of September, you can, if the property's vacant, you can have one person go and look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is just,
looking at hundreds
really
of properties, Veronica, and you'd say this, like, sometimes you get completely hoodwinked, I guess. Like you see the photos, the street, everything looks great.
You can't
get
see
in the
how
front
high
door, and then there's something glaringly wrong with the property, right? It just got this weird feel. Hallways are too narrow, or just
ceiling height's really low.
Yeah, it smells. The neighbour's got something out the backyard that completely, or there's a creek that's got mosquitoes, like just things that you need to experience, and and wouldn't it be bad, right? If you bought a property, you got so excited, you went in there, got your keys, and then as soon as you walked in, you realised that you made a massive mistake. And I'm sure there's people coming out on the other side with a $1 million plus decision. So great dumbo, Brendan. Thanks so much for coming on, mate. And it'd be interesting to have another chat next year sometime because we'll see how this election's going to go.
Thanks very much, Chris, Veronica. A pleasure as always.
And all the best with your purchase.
If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a dumbo.